Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. So as we wait to jump live back into the Timothy Jones Jr. trial, let's not forget that we're going to be live in 3 different courtrooms today, and I want to talk about one of our biggest cases. We are going to be back in the McStay family murder trial, which is coming to a close after 5 months of testimony. Charles Merritt could face the death penalty for allegedly killing his former business partner, Joseph McStay, his wife, Summer, and their 2 young sons, Gianni and Joseph Jr. It's a brutal crime that the prosecution says was motivated by the defendant's greed. The defense is saying the state has the wrong man. We're going to hear more of that today as the defense will continue with their closing argument. But let's go back to yesterday when the prosecution began with their closing argument. That is a long period of time for a jury to be seated, and I want to break down what we just saw. Joining me is trial attorney Katie Cherkasky. Katie, great to have you back here on Law&Crime. And I got to ask you, from a practical point of view, isn't this tough for the prosecution to just keep the attention of the jury for almost 6 months, and now they're hearing the closing arguments? This is a tough case for them, I would imagine.
I absolutely agree with that. It's a long time. There's a lot of testimony, a lot of technical information as well. So I think that the prosecution's theme in their closing was a good idea to say, you need to look at the totality of the circumstances here. You can't just take each piece. Of course, the defense is going to do the opposite and chip away at each piece of evidence. But I think that was a good thing to put in the minds of the jurors after all this time. It makes it easier for them, really.
Yeah, keep it big picture. I get it. But let me ask you about that big picture. The idea of that he killed this family for financial gain. Let's not forget, that's really what it was. He had a lot more to gain with this family out of the way. He was able to, according to the prosecution, pilfer off money from Joseph McStay's business. Do you hold weight to that theory? Does it make sense to you?
I've always struggled with that in this case. I think that the motive is a little bit weak for the gruesomeness of the crime, but that's not to say that it's not the motive. I think it's possible. I wish that the prosecution had more for themselves, but they just don't seem to have anything else besides that motive on the financial side. So it's possible. And I think what the prosecution was saying about taking all the other pieces that support the murder in general, not just the motive, will get them potentially over that hump. But it's not the strongest motive, for sure.
Let's break down this case now. Let's see what they have. Let's see the different layers, because the prosecution in their closing argument started talking more about what they say are the facts of this case. Well, Katie, we could talk about, as we talked about before, how the motive seems a little weak, but at the end of the day, isn't it a little odd what the defendant allegedly did? You know, engaging in these financial transactions after seemingly his best friend goes missing, his behavior before this happens as well. I mean, what do you make of this?
Yeah, it's a very bad coincidence for him if it's not pointing to his guilt. So it certainly is another piece of the puzzle for the prosecution. And there's a lot to get over there with the timing and with all the other pieces that come together around the time that the family goes missing. That could very well have been the motive, and maybe things got carried away. Who knows? But it seems like it makes sense to me.
And let me ask you this, the idea that, you know, he had opportunity to do this because he was close in their lives. He knew where they lived. He had access to the house. What do you make of that part? That it wouldn't be a complete stranger, but somebody that really knew this family that ultimately was responsible for the deaths?
Well, I think that has to be the theory. And of course, the defense has the alternate suspect that they've tried to point to, or they're going to try to point to even more in closing. But yeah, absolutely. I think that the specific gruesomeness of the crime really indicates that there has to be somebody that knows these people. Of course, there's always that possibility that it's some unknown suspect, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense here.
Do you think that the killings happened in the house and that that whoever did it killed them in the house, cleaned everything up, took them to the desert, and buried the bodies? Or is there enough to suggest that perhaps the killings didn't happen in the house, but they really happened in the desert? What do you think?
Well, a lot of the testimony regarding the state of the bodies at the time that they were found and the state of the house itself and the lack of forensic evidence for a lot of what could have happened or what did happen here, it makes it very confusing to me, I guess, to say the least. I think they were probably killed in the house personally. I think that if it was planned out, obviously there was a plan and there was time to prepare to clean everything up and then to transport the bodies. I think it would have been a lot more difficult, needless to say, to transport a family of four against their will that far away. So logically speaking, I think they were probably killed in the house, even though the evidence tends to be a little bit weak in some of that.
Also, it appears that the state of the body of Joseph McStay Sr. was different than the rest of the family, and maybe that's why it could be indicated that he was killed at a different time and a different manner as the rest of the other family. The reason this has captured the nation's attention is because it is a mystery. It is a mystery. We're all still trying to figure out exactly what happened. We're hearing from the prosecution in their closing argument. We're expecting to hear more from the defense in their closing argument today at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But I do want to let you know, it's just one of three cases that we're going to be live in today, one of three trials, one of three courtrooms. So Katie, what we're listening to from the prosecution is that in the period before this family disappears, prosecutors saying, hey, listen, Joseph McStay, he cut the defendant out of his business. He said he owed him money. And this is really, the timing of it couldn't even be more suspect. But the defense is saying they're mischaracterizing their whole relationship. They're mischaracterizing their whole financial relationship and what was really going on. Your thoughts?
Well, I thought it was interesting. The prosecution was kind of arguing some hypotheticals, which you typically see from the defense side and not the prosecution side. So I don't know how strong that was, but I think that it does give the jurors something to think about as far as the timeline is concerned, and gives them that possibility that was, strengthening of the motive.
Well, let me ask you this. Can you have a successful prosecution? Can you get a guilty verdict if you don't know exactly how these people died, where they died, why they died, how this happened? Can you?
Yes, you can, I think. And I think that, the weight of the evidence, even if it's circumstantial, I think can be overwhelming. And even though it's been years and years since a lot of this happened and a lot of the testimony is from that perspective, I think they can get over that, but they do have a lot of work to do. It's difficult, and there's a lot of reasonable doubt that the defense can point out, for sure.
Let's talk about that. The defense began their closing argument. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see it, but I know you've been following this case. Their argument that the state investigators, they have the wrong man. Charles Merritt, he didn't do this. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's great. I think it's a great strategy. I think that they have really honed in on that. And I think that's a reasonable alternative, because if you're going to present a defense to a murder case, you want to have a suspect. I think it's stronger for the defense to have an alternate suspect than to say reasonable doubt, and that's all we have, and some random person murdered this family. That's a lot tougher pill for the jury to swallow, I would imagine.
They have to, though. And we've seen cases before where if you just give the kind of the inference that someone else did it, you give the possibility that someone else did it. I mean, how much does the defense actually have to prove that someone else did it? I mean, you tell me, what's that threshold? What's that line?
Well, of course, they don't have to prove anything, but there is that innate humane desire to understand something like this, and something so horrific as a whole family being murdered, that it would be tough to say it was just a random killer if they don't have any evidence of that. But it's possible. I mean, you could certainly get enough reasonable doubt to say, I don't know what happened. Maybe it was him. Probably it was him. And sure, that's not even reasonable doubt. So if they get to that point and they just aren't over that hump, then they could acquit even without believing that the alternate suspect was the killer.
It's a long way to go, though. We still have a defense's closing argument to continue for today. Who knows how long that will be. And then also the prosecution is free to put on their own rebuttal closing argument. And then finally, it is going to be in the hands of that jury after almost 6 months since they were seated to make a determination about the fate of Charles Merritt. And if they find him guilty, the next question is, would they sentence him to death? A lot at stake here, a lot for them to consider. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to talk about our live trials today. Stay tuned here on Law&Crime.